Hello, AP Comparative. Happy Friday. This is Andrew Canine from the suburbs of Chicago, broadcasting live from Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. We are making our way through what I think is the best social science class in the AP stable of classes, and that is AP Comparative Government. And we are now just starting our second unit that's fair game for this revised exam in 2020. We are looking at political institutions of all 6 core countries of AP Comparative Government. And today we are looking at executive systems. So thank you for joining us. If you are brand new, welcome to the AP Comparative Lessons. I teach at Adlai E. Stevenson High School in the north suburbs of Chicago. And I would really encourage you to get the course description from College Board. This really pertains to the coding that I use. For instance, today is topic 2, lesson 3, so 2.3 in executive systems. If that coding's new to you, do yourself a favor, download the course description. You can also get it at this link, or you can go to our website, The Two Teachers, put together by Mr. Dan Larson, and go visit the Comparative Corner where you can see the notes that I add that you'll see in the slides. Our exam is May 22nd at noon Eastern time. And if you want to see more particulars to the exam, please visit the link that provides what questions are asked. And I'm going to try to model some of those questions as we go through the lessons. Favorite part of the lesson, always shout outs. We love to celebrate great students. We love to celebrate great teachers. Maggie gave such a nice shout out to Mr. Poza at Basis Shavano High School in San Antonio, Texas. 2 Texas shout outs today, I might add. What a nice note. If you would like to shout out to your teacher or get your name of your high school mentioned here in the broadcast, use that hashtag APCompGov 2020. Maggie, thank you for those very kind words. Thank you to all the students who have said such kind things about their teachers, particularly in this unsettling time. It's very heartwarming to read your thoughts about people who made a difference at your school. And Emmanuel, thank you for our first shout out to classmates. Let's not forget that in addition to missing those teachers, those classmates, your friends, your group mates, and Emmanuel thanked them all, Nathaniel and his crew, Kiana, Allison, and Sandra, who collaborated with Emmanuel, and Emmanuel gave some very nice thoughts. If you have a small group of students that you collaborated with, give them a shout out at hashtag APCompGov 2020. Thank you for your nice words, Emmanuel. It reminded me of those groups in our class, our comparative government class at Stevenson, who work so effectively, who build those friendships through the class as we learn comparative government. So thank you again. Yesterday, I left you with a question about describing your ideal branch, your executive branch. And specifically, we're looking at today the roles of the chief executive in some countries called the head of state and the head of government. And we're going to learn that some of our countries combine those roles into one person, and some of our countries separate those roles. So it was an interesting discussion on social media. We saw some students who really believed in the merged roles of the head of state and head of government, so a single person having that executive authority. But then we also had some innovative ideas on countries or government systems that work best with a unicameral legislature instead of a bicameral or 2-chambered legislature. And oh man, we got into some Unit 4 material with election systems. Don't forget about Unit 4. We know that Unit 4 is not on this exam, but the elections and how these officials get into office in the national legislature or the national executive is really important as well. In fact, today's lesson, we're focused mostly on the structure of executive systems, but I'm going to give you a hint at some of that Unit 4 material in terms of how those executives get in there. So thank you for those ideas on your ideal government. Feel free to use that hashtag APCompGov 2020. You can also get in there if you're interested to see the latest of Nigerian political activism that is hot on the hashtag APCompGov 2020 in calling out different national and local officials. It's quite interesting, quite interesting. Today, we are looking at the executive system. It's lesson 2.3. We're looking at how executives compare. We're going to connect this into our next lesson, particularly on how executives can be removed, if they can be removed. We know we have some core countries where the executive really can't be removed. And we will continue to connect these to the skills of the class. We are making our way now through Unit 2. We'll then make our way through Unit 3 as we do some reviews on all 5 units before we end our YouTube lessons on May the 1st. And stay tuned. At the end of each lesson, I give you some questions that I wrote, both some multiple choice and those FRQs, and try to model some good writing for you. So what you need to know today is our vocabulary list. And I'm going to warn you today that as we look at executive systems, and a number of these lessons through Unit 2, you're going to see more content, more specific content about each of the core countries. And so you'll notice that, and I'm trying to bring your attention, as I go over information that's straight from the course description, I'll put an asterisk, which indicates this is specific content that College Board and AP expects teachers to teach and students to know. So I'm going to bring you to that. We also know that a number of core concepts and vocabulary words are identified in each of our units, and today there's no exception. So you should know that what a head of state is, that the head of state is the person who represents the nation in more ceremonial functions. We're going to see that in some of our countries, the head of state is also more in charge of foreign policy and international relations. And that contrasts with the executive role called the head of government. And this is the person that we sometimes call the chief executive, who is in charge of the bureaucracy implementing laws through bureaucratic agencies or delegating those powers to the executive cabinet. The executive cabinet essentially plays the same function in all of our countries. No matter if it's democratic or authoritarian, an executive cabinet is empowered to try to enforce the laws. In a typical model, the legislature writes the laws, the executive branch enforces those laws, and the executive cabinet are those top officials from those high-profile departments in charge of implementing those laws. Commander-in-chief is in charge of the military, you know that term. And then I mentioned this term yesterday, the prime minister is the person who is empowered to be the head of the national legislature. And in a typical model, the prime minister is also the head of government. So not only is that person in charge of the national legislature and setting the agenda for domestic legislation, but also in charge of making sure that that legislation is enacted. We see the word bureaucracy mentioned a little bit in AP Comparative Government, and today you'll see the specific synonym for bureaucracy being the civil service, and that is the makeup of the bureaucracy. So every government, no matter whether it's democratic or authoritarian, no matter whether it's federal or unitary, has some semblance of a bureaucracy to implement policies. That bureaucracy is always part of an executive branch. And then sometimes we use that synonym instead of bureaucracy. Sometimes that synonym for bureaucracy of civil service is used to describe the permanent workers in a bureaucracy who implement laws. And again, every country has a bureaucracy to implement laws. In terms of specific content that you are expected to know, again, I'm going to make a special point that anything with an asterisk comes from the AP course description. And so there's some particular content, and really I want you to pay attention to where specific countries are noted, because you're going to see some nitty-gritty details that maybe we haven't gotten into in previous lessons. So governments have executive institutions, I was just mentioning that before, to implement the laws. Cabinets are part of that structure. Titles, powers, and structure vary in the different countries. So let's start with China. China has the president, their top executive official is called the president, Xi Jinping, and this person serves in a number of different roles. He is the commander-in-chief, and we know he's the commander-in-chief because in China, the president also chairs what's called China's Military Commission. And also the president has the role of general secretary of the Communist Party. The president does have the role in China of not just being commander-in-chief and being in charge of the party, but the president nominates the premier, also known as the prime minister, of the National People's Congress, who then serves as the head of government to oversee the civil service. So in China, the premier or the prime minister, who's nominated by the president, acts as head of government, and that's the person who's in charge of implementing the laws through the different departments and agencies in China. And then, of course, you know that China does not have national elections in order to select these individuals. Instead, those decisions are made by the Communist Party, what's called the Politburo. Those decisions are made behind closed doors. There are factions in the Politburo, rivals for power, but those are not public meetings. And there's certainly no direct public input on who becomes those executive leaders. I'll make a couple different notes that China's premier is limited to 2 terms in office. Those terms are typically been 5 years in office, and leads the government state council, and must be a member of Communist Party's Politburo Standing Committee. I think that leading the state council might be a little bit embellished. I'm going to go and double check that for the premier, but he's definitely a very high-ranking official when it comes to the implementation of law, and working with the state council would be the more accurate way to put that. While chosen by the Communist Party, the premier must be approved by the National People's Congress, but that's always what we call a rubber stamp. The National People's Congress doesn't ever reject the president's choice for premier. That's just not part of the system in China. There's no independence of that national legislature. And again, the role of the Communist Party is that this is a top-down selection process. It's the top of the Communist Party that is selecting the members within that are below. And this is not a bottom-up selection process, although in paper and in the Constitution, the impression is given that this is a bottom-up process, but it's really those top government officials who fill the positions down through the bureaucracy. Iran, their top executive is called the Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader, by the way, let me mention, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, but you might have mentioned, you've seen that the Chinese premier is limited to 2 terms in office. You probably know that China's president no longer has term limits. I'm going to get to that, particularly in topic 2.4 and 2.5, in terms of the removal, or spoiler alert, the non-removal of a Chinese president. So I will get to that in a future lesson. When it comes to Iran, another leader who's pretty much there, or the culture has been there for the rest of his life, is the Supreme Leader. In Iran, the Supreme Leader really does act as the head of state. There have only been 2 Supreme Leaders in Iranian political history since 1979. Those Supreme Leaders, according to the Constitution, are supreme. They set the political agenda. They serve as the commander-in-chief. They appoint the top ministers, and by top ministers, we typically mean the intelligence ministers or the ministers related to oil and energy, big revenue producers in Iran. And we know that the Supreme Leader has big appointment powers of appointing members to prominent government committees. In Iran, we call one of those the Expediency Council. The other very powerful group of government leaders is the Guardian Council and the head of the judiciary. So Supreme Leader has tremendous power of appointment in overseeing to make sure that government policy upholds Shia Islam. And I mentioned this before, there's a Farsi word, Valiyat Faqih. You don't have to know Farsi on the exam, but you should know that Iran's Supreme Leader is the head of state and guides all laws and policies to make sure that they fit Shia Islam and Sharia law. As I mentioned before, the Supreme Leader appoints top intelligence officials and military officials, including those who control the state-owned broadcast, which is immense in Iran. Iran is a theocracy, so the Supreme Leader does have to be a top-ranking cleric, it doesn't have to be the highest-ranking cleric, but a top-ranking cleric of Shia Islam, Technically, the Supreme Leader has term limits of 10 years. Technically, the Supreme Leader is selected by the Assembly of Experts every 10 years. The Assembly Experts is elected in elections, so there's an indirect selection of the Supreme Leader. But again, the reality is there have only been 2 Supreme Leaders since 1979. And the tradition is once someone is selected as Supreme Leader, they stay there until their death. Iran does have a directly elected president, however, and that president has 2 4-year terms. And there's a 2-term limit, a 2 consecutive term limit in Iran of 4 years each. The current president is Hassan Rouhani. He is serving now the 2nd of his terms in office. And the president is the head of government, which means the president oversees civil service. Iran's a little bit different from a typical head of state, head of government, where Iran's president does have some responsibilities in foreign policy, but that foreign policy is going to be approved by the Supreme Leader. So the Iran's president is second fiddle when he plays the role of head of government. So one of the foreign policies that Iran's president got to oversee, particularly with this president, Hassan Rouhani, was when there was the executive agreement with the United States about the Iranian nuclear agreement. And so that would be one of those areas of foreign policy that the president did have a role in playing when there was an agreement with the Obama administration about the nuclear agreement. But let's not kid ourselves. The Supreme Leader essentially gave the approval for that particular foreign policy. As I mentioned before, the president is directly elected with terms of 4 years. And interestingly enough, the Iranian president is elected with the same type of election system that Russia's president has been elected with, and that's the 2 rounds of balloting, where the winner of the presidential election has to secure an absolute majority of the vote, either in the first round or if needed in the second round between the 2 top vote getters in order to be elected president. But Iran's president is directly elected. Mexico's president is also directly elected. Mexico's president serves as both the head of state and head of government. Mexico's president is the commander-in-chief, is also the leader of the bureaucracy as the head of government. So the Mexico's president oversees the implementation of laws, has to approve domestic legislation, and is actually the leader of foreign policy in Mexico. Mexico has, and you'll see this more in the next topic, 2.4 and 2.5, Mexico's president is restricted to 1 term of 6 years. In Spanish, that is called the sexenio. It is a 1-term limit of 6 years for Mexico's president, who's directly elected. Like we see with Nigeria, Mexico's president directly appoints the cabinet, who do need the approval of Mexico's Senate. And as I mentioned before, Mexico's president has this fixed term of 6 years. And of note, Mexico's president does not need to win a majority of the vote in order to be elected. If there are 3 major contenders for presidency, the winning candidate in Mexico only needs to secure the most votes, otherwise known as the plurality of the vote. And again, that's getting into some detail about election that's more specific detail in Unit 4. So I don't want to give the impression that you have to know all the ins and outs of how these presidents are elected or the specific rules like plurality or majority, but I just wanted to give you a taste of that because that is how these officials get into office. Nigeria's president, very, very similar to Mexico's president, also directly elected in a slightly different system, serves as head of state and head of government, and and commander-in-chief. And here's where we see that word civil service as a synonym for bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy, in this case, the civil service, is simply implementing laws through bureaucratic departments and agencies. Like Mexico's president, they approve domestic legislation in Nigeria, and they conduct foreign policy. Very similar, president appoints members of the cabinet, have to be approved by Nigeria's Senate, the upper chamber in Nigeria's national legislature. Nigeria's presidential elections are very unique in that there has to be a national support system to be elected as Nigeria's president. There is a direct election to be elected as Nigeria's president. There again are fixed terms of every 4 years, and the winning candidate has to secure a majority of the national vote, but also has to win at least 25% of the vote in 3/4 of the states. And this is to ensure that Nigeria's president is elected with some semblance of national support. And that would reflect Nigeria's federalism in wanting this very diverse country geographically and ethno-religiously to have some degree of backing of the president. In Russia, we separate the roles of head of state and head of government. The prime minister of Russia is considered to be the head of government and oversees the civil service, and is the prime minister is appointed by the president. The president is the head of state. The president is typically the most important person in the system, especially when Vladimir Putin is the president. When Vladimir Putin was prime minister for 4 years, in between his 2 sets of terms, prime minister was really important in Russia. So power tends to follow where Putin goes. But in this case, when Putin's been the president, tremendous power as both the head of state and the commander in chief, and the president's power to appoint the prime minister and top ministers in the cabinet. And the president presides over the legislature, also known as the Duma, in certain circumstances. Similar to Iran, Russia's head of state oversees the key ministries, what are sometimes called the power ministries, the intelligence ministries, the military. In Russia, we call the intelligence ministry the FSB, or the Foreign Intelligence Service. The president also nominates the prime minister in Russia, who I mentioned before. That prime minister serves as the head of government. It does have to be approved by the legislature. And the president can also appoint top judges in what's called dissolve the Duma, which dissolve the Duma is not, it's not forceful. It's just a term that's used to mean that Duma and those legislators have to face election again. To call for new legislative elections is the comparative term we mean for dissolving the Duma. Russia does have direct elections, as far as we know, until those constitutional changes come. The president is elected directly for 6-year terms. That wasn't always that case. The first 2 terms that Putin served as president, the president's term length was 4 years in office. And there has been a rule to be president that you can serve no more than 2 consecutive terms, which is why Putin served as president for 2 terms initially until 2008, took a hiatus, became prime minister, very powerful prime minister, and then returned to the presidency through election in 2012, and now is scheduled to end this presidential term in 2024. And who knows what will happen after 2024. But I think we all know Putin will still be around, and he'll still be pretty powerful in whatever form of government gets adopted. I mentioned before, Iran and Russia have a very similar election system. The rule is you have to win a majority of the votes. And every time Putin has run, and every president since 2000, they always get a majority of votes in that first round of balloting. So the United Kingdom is, for a lot of my students, they understand the United Kingdom. I think it's kind of complex, this relationship in the executive system, because the United Kingdom is a kingdom. The monarch is the monarch, and she is the head of state. And the head of state, when you watch the videos of how the head of state and the queen is treated at these different ceremonies, it looks like she's in charge of everything. And yet it's really it's symbolic. It's the figurehead monarchy, where the monarch has some responsibilities as head of state. Certainly there's some ceremonial positions. We know she made the speech. kind of putting people at ease in the United Kingdom about COVID-19, but that's what a head of state does in the United Kingdom. The real power in the United Kingdom in terms of the executive rests with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister secures his or her position by being the leader of the majority party in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister is the head of government. Not only is the Prime Minister in charge of setting the legislative agenda, because the Prime Minister is the top party member in the national legislature and the most powerful chamber of the legislature, Commons, but the Prime Minister also implements that legislation, is in charge of the cabinet and the civil service in the United Kingdom, implementing legislation and the law. And the United Kingdom's Prime Minister also serves as the de facto commander-in-chief. Here's where it gets a little confusing. Technically, the Queen, the monarch, is the commander-in-chief, but through tradition, it's actually the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's top cabinet members in charge of the military who are making those military policy decisions. And so as the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister is head of government, in charge of overseeing the cabinet and how the cabinet kind of drafts legislation, formulates policy, and then how that policy is implemented through the executive. If you have your own specific opinions about your preferred structure of an executive system, make sure you tweet those out to hashtag APCompGov2020, particularly if you're taking AP US government as well, and you have to know the ins and outs of the executive branch for the American system. Here's where, if some of those term limits, those selection processes, the different structures sound interesting to you, here's where you can share your opinions with the comparative community. After we looked at the what you need to know, we always go into some questions about the content. Today's first question is, which are accurate titles for China's top executive in its governing system? So let's look at some of those nitty-gritty details that the course description expects you to know about executive systems and to see how well you remembered them. So what are the accurate titles for China's top executive in its governing system? And hopefully you remember that China's top executive is the president, who's also the general secretary of the Communist Party and is also the commander-in-chief. I guess the title for commander-in-chief is actually, if you remember, the title of the commander-in-chief is the chair of China's military commission, but we can use commander-in-chief as a fill-in there. So that C is the answer. How about Iran's supreme leader? What's an accurate description of the powers of Iran's supreme leader? Head of government and commander-in-chief, appoints half the Guardian Council and the head of judiciary, the head of state and the head of government, or the president and the commander-in-chief. And hopefully you remember that Iran's supreme leader, their top executive, is the head of state. Well, that is not correct, is it? So we're going to fix that. I thought there would be a glitch in today's lesson. We're just going to get rid of that. And we know that B is the answer. All right. Sorry about that. Question number 3, compares Mexico with Nigeria. Which is an accurate comparison of the executive structures of Mexico and Nigeria? Mexico separates the roles of head of state and head of government to different people, while Nigeria has one person serve in both roles. Both countries have one person serve as head of state and head of government. Nigeria separates the roles of head of state and head of government to different people, while Mexico has one person serve both roles. Or both countries separate the roles of head of state and head of government to different people. Hopefully I have the right answer this time, and I think I do. It's B. Both countries have one person serve as head of state and head of government in Mexico. And I think this might be our final question, which is an accurate comparison of the executive structures of Russia and the United Kingdom. So I'm going to give you a chance to take a look at those. And the answer here is that both countries separate the roles of head of state and head of government to different people. So that would be a similarity in the comparison between Russia and the United Kingdom. Oh, we have one more question. A different way to look at this, which is the correct pairing of countries with the executive roles. So in the left-hand column, we have commander-in-chief. In the right-hand column, we have oversees the civil service. We have different titles of members of the different executive branches. So which is the correct pairing of countries with executive roles? And the correct answer for our final multiple choice question is that Russia's president is the commander-in-chief, while Nigeria's president oversees the civil service. Now we know that this revised exam for 2020 will not have multiple choice, but this becomes just a quick way to practice some of the details of the content. Some of the details of the content are fair game for a free response, and they're details that you can put into free response questions. I'm going to give you a sample FRQ that kind of replicates. I was playing around with the quantitative analysis, and I was trying to come up with a quantitative analysis that didn't necessarily use numeric data, but to create an infographic. So, typical quantitative analysis, we're talking about analyzing data. I've certainly shown some examples of that, but I wanted to get creative with today's lesson to turn today's lesson into a quantitative analysis with no data. So we're going to create information. So here is your table of information, and I simply took some of the content that I just delivered to you, that we have head of state column, we have the head of government, and we have the commander-in-chief, and I've named the specific person who holds that power and authority today in 2020. And by the way, current event, we heard that Boris Johnson was making some improvement in the hospital as a current event connected with COVID-19. And there is an asterisk next to Boris Johnson's name that as commander-in-chief, that he or the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, serves as the de facto commander-in-chief. So that's the table of information with the different leaders. So let's see what the question is on this table of an infographic, if you will. So I'm gonna turn this into 4 questions. So this will be a 4-point rubric today. Traditionally, on a regular AP exam, this quantitative analysis question would be a 5-point rubric, but we know this question is going to be modified on the test on May 22nd. So I'm just playing around with this kind of a unique way to do information, and here's the question. So using information in the table, identify 2 countries that separate the roles of its executive system to different people. Letter B, using information in the table, describe the executive systems of 2 countries that structure their executive systems differently. For letter C, pick a listed country and explain how the structure of its executive system could impact its government's political stability. And then letter D, pick a listed country different from C and explain how the structure of its executive system could impact its government's political legitimacy. So here for A and B, we're specifically using information from the table, and you really have to articulate that in order to get the maximum number of points on the rubric. But then in C and D, we're taking information from the table, and now you're expected to connect it to other concepts. And these are 2 other concepts that I've covered before, specifically from Unit 1, political stability and political legitimacy. So let's see a model of how this could be written. According to the table, identify 2 countries that separate the roles of the executive system to different people. And again, we're going back to the table, and we have specific names, and it's just a matter of figuring out that Iran and Russia are 2 of the countries that separate the roles of its executive system to different people. And so you need to be able to write that clearly with the correct information, and very key, you're not going to get credit unless you actually use the information from the table. So it's a matter of saying that Iran is one of the countries listed that separates its power. Be specific. Tell me that Ali Khamenei is the head of state. You don't have to know that specifically. You don't have to know names for the exam. If you know names of leaders for the exam, it certainly helps. But you'll notice that in that content I was delivering earlier, I didn't list those names. But because that information is given in the information table, you really need to drop the name in there to do what the question's asking you to do, to use information in the table. So that's where you have to use the name Ali Khamenei as the head of state, and the head of government's name as Hassan Rouhani. And then for Russia, we are looking for you to use the information that Putin is the head of state and Mishustin is the head of government. So use information from the table. I've been suggesting, you see, I'm trying to replicate this, of labeling, writing different paragraphs, writing different sections. And one of the areas where you can't go wrong with your labeling, create a nice, neat essay, A, B, C, but then cross out your labels. And that tends to take care of any questions about that practice. For letter B, using the information in the table, describe the executive systems of two different countries, different from A, that structure their executive systems differently. While China is a second country listed that separates power to its head of state, Xi Jinping, and its head of government, Li Keqiang. Mexico keeps its power of the head of state, head of government, and commander-in-chief into one person, and I have to use information from the table, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. Okay, so make sure you are specific with how you write this, and make sure you identify two countries. I see a lot of times when students are asked to talk about two countries, for some reason they talk about one country and they never specify the second country. And that would be a mistake, particularly for this type of question, where letter B is worth up to 2 points if there's a correct description about the executive systems in two countries. C gets a little bit more complicated. For letter C, pick a, sorry, if I said letter B was worth 2 points, that is not correct. That is worth 1 point in the rubric typically, all right? So letter C, pick a listed country and explain how the structure of its executive system could impact its government's political stability. So now we're taking the information from the table about the structure, and now you got to take and connect structure with this word political stability, a term we looked at in Unit 1. Be really clear. And you know my suggestion, repeating the vocabulary of the question and making sure you elaborate just in case you didn't say it right in the first sentence. Try to write 2-3 sentences about this, and always, 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 when the question directs you to explain how or explain why, always include a word of causation, making sure that you are for sure explaining how in this case. Mexico's political stability can be strengthened with an executive system that keeps its power of the head of state, head of government, and commander-in-chief in one person. I dropped a name from the table. This structure could help strengthen political stability in Mexico because of the policy uniformity that should result in having one person control policies related to foreign relations, implementation of domestic law, and with the military. So one person's in charge of all these policies, so there should be a uniformity in that policy. There is less chance of having conflicting policies in these areas when one person holds all of these roles, and this feature can help to strengthen political stability in Mexico. So getting those words of causation, because kind of in here, providing that evidence that political stability can be strengthened with having one person holding those responsibilities because of policy uniformity. Similarly, in letter D, it also directs you to explain how, make sure there's a word of causation. In this case, we have to use the word political legitimacy. Don't feel like you have to use synonyms for these words that you're connecting them to. Use that word. Be really clear with what you're trying to communicate. So you notice before, I used political stability a couple of different times. That's perfectly fine to do to clearly communicate correct information, which is what we want you to do in a comparative government FRQ. So Iran's political legitimacy can be weakened with an executive system that separates the power of head of state and commander-in-chief, and I dropped the name from the table, and its president as head of government. Dropped another name from the table. This structure could weaken political legitimacy in Mexico. Whoops, here's where I screwed this up. Because the leader who is directly elected, President Rouhani, has less power. Let me fix this. Man, I needed a copy editor today. Always go back and double check. Because the leader who is directly elected, Rouhani, has less power. Iran's political legitimacy could be weakened by the structure. I put in because again, I didn't underline it this time, but that's your word of causation you want to make sure it's complete. Because this could lead the Iranian people to believe that their voices are not influential with the leader who controls the military, since Rouhani is not commander-in-chief. So connecting political legitimacy to the reality that the supreme leader is not elected, unlike the president, who actually has less power, and emphasizing these words of causation and being complete. Don't be shy about adding another sentence. And if you have time, adding another 2 sentences with content that you understand, and always going back and making sure that you're connecting your answer with words from the prompt and making sure you're doing what the question directs you to do. In this case, explain how. Please use a word of causation for that. So that is my tips for FRQ writing as it relates to executive systems. If you were perhaps to see a question that was designed in a table like that, you should be familiar with these terms today: the head of state, head of government, what a cabinet does, commander-in-chief, the prime minister, and the civil service as a synonym for bureaucracy. You're going to see we're going to be bringing up this topic also in our next lesson on the removal of the executive and executive term limits, and then also later in Unit 2 as we look at the legislatures and the judiciaries, as Unit 2 focuses on political institutions. I mentioned before, if you have specific examples from our countries of executive systems, use our hashtag. And I'm leaving you off with a challenge. This worked really well earlier this week, where I asked people to use the hashtag to suggest an argument. I'm going to write a full argument essay for our next lesson. That next lesson, again, is on executive term limits and the removal of an executive. If you have a suggestion for an argument essay, please feel free to use Twitter. Suggest that. It was great collaboration earlier this week. So what would you suggest in terms of what type of argument a student could make? What are the 3 words, 3 vocabulary words that are core concepts that argument should connect with? So suggestions on argument essays, I'm accepting them all weekend long before our next lesson. Have a wonderful weekend. If you have someone who has technology needs, reach out to College Board, and I will see you again on Monday, April 13th, as we look at how executives can, or in some cases cannot be removed. Have a wonderful weekend and be well.